Meantime, we shall express our darker purpose. Give me the map there. Know that we have divided in three our kingdom, and 'tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we unburdened crawl towards death. Our son of Cornwall, and you, our no less loving son of Albany, we have this hour a constant will to publish our daughters' several dowers, that future strife may be prevented now. The princes France and Burgundy, great rivals in our youngest daughter's love, long in our court have made their amorous sojourn, and here are to be answered. Tell me, my daughters, since now we will divest us both of rule, interest of territory, cares of state, which of you, shall we say, doth love us most, that we our largest bounty may extend where nature doth with merit challenge? Goneril, our eldest born, speak first.
Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter, dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty, beyond what can be valued, rich or rare, no less than life with grace, health, beauty, honor, as much as child e'er loved or father found, a love that makes breath poor and speech unable, beyond all manner of so much I love you. And what shall Cordelia do? Love and be silent?
Of all these bounds, even from this line to this, with shadowy forests and with champaigns riched, with plenteous rivers and wide-skirted meads, we make thee lady. To thine and Albany's issue be this perpetual. And what says our second daughter, our dearest Regan, wife to Cornwall? Speak.
Sir, I am made of the self-same metal that my sister is, and prize me at her worth. In my true heart I find she names my very deed of love, only she comes too short. That I profess myself an enemy to all other joys which the most precious square of sense possesses, and find I am alone felicitate in your dear highness love. Then poor Cordelia, and yet not so, since I am sure my love's more richer than my tongue.
To thee and thine hereditary ever remain this ample third of our fair kingdom, no less in space, validity, and pleasure than that conferred on Goneril. Now, our joy, although the last not least, to whose young love the vines of France and milk of Burgundy strive to be entrusted, what can you say, to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak.
Nothing, my lord.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again.
Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less.
How, Cordelia? Mend your speech a little, lest it may mar your fortunes.
Good my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as are right fit, obey you, love you, and most honor you. Why have my sisters husbands, if they say they love you all? Haply when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty. Sure, I shall never marry like my sisters to love my father all.
But goes thy heart with this?
Aye, good my lord.
So young and so untender.
So young, my lord, and true.
Let it be so. Thy truth then be thy dower. For by the sacred radiance of the sun, the mysteries of Hecate and the night, by all the operation of the orbs from whom we do exist and cease to be, here I disclaim all my paternal care, propinquity and property of blood, and as a stranger to my heart and me hold thee from this forever. The barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generations messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighboured, pitied, and relieved as thou my sometime daughter.
King Lear, Act 1, Scene 1.
welcome or welcome back to Professing Literature. Whenever you're listening to this and wherever you're listening to it from, we thank you for joining us. We are coming to you from Oklahoma City in the early winter of the year of grace 2023. Professing Literature is the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of seeing writers in action. Our goal is to work across literary genres and modes, comedy and tragedy, drama, poetry, and fiction, looking at the dynamics of the passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work as a whole, the issues that it clarifies, the techniques that are involved. I am David Anderson. I'm a professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma, and I am joined by Mr. Eric Williams, my producer. Hello, Eric.
Hello, hello.
How you doing? The last time we saw each other, I think, was at a 6-year-old's birthday party. So that's the kind of speed we move at these days.
Yes. It was a great party.
Oh, yeah. The child in question has the same last name as I do. So, yes, we were very glad to have you as guest. I know I was. Children's birthday parties are unquestionably a good thing, but for a 40-something, they're not necessarily an exciting thing.
Well, the food was great. I probably ate more than my share.
Well, good.
Than I should have.
Good. I was enjoying it myself, and I think the kids did too. And striking that balance of food that adults can enjoy and kids can enjoy also is a tricky one. Rather different concerns right now as we are sitting here recording another podcast episode. I will mention to you, our listeners, whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you're an old hand with us, please subscribe, rate, and review us. All of that helps our little endeavor here. So whatever service you listen on, we would be happy to have that. And we'd certainly be happy to have any feedback. We love getting emails. And the address, of course, Eric, if you don't mind.
professingliterature@protonmail.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, a bunch of you have got in touch, and please know that you're welcome to do so again. Today, we're back on familiar territory. We are talking once again about Shakespeare. And that's great. Striking the right balance where Shakespeare is concerned on this podcast is something I think about because I teach a lot of Shakespeare and it's sort of second nature to me. And so knowing how often I should dip into that particular bag is a tricky question. But I think we've got to give our listeners at least a couple of Shakespeare episodes every season, if we can think of them as seasons. And so today we've actually got the first of a two-parter, our second two-parter on Professing Literature. We're going to do 2 podcasts on King Lear, not with the goal of sort of comprehensively surveying the whole play. I think that would be very reductive and out of the spirit of what it is we do here. But just because one episode on King Lear does not seem like enough. King Lear is a very important play for me. It's probably the piece of writing that in my career I've spent the most time thinking about and maybe done my best work. We'll see whether or not that translates into a great podcast episode. It might be one of those things where I'm too close to it to speak as coherently about it as I might. But it's a joy to sit down and think about this play again, even though the play itself is very somber, to put it mildly. King Lear has long been known as one of the so-called great tragedies of Shakespeare. There are 4 plays that for more than a century now have been dubbed the great tragedies, written at the same point in Shakespeare's career, or in the same part of Shakespeare's career, roughly the third quarter of Shakespeare's career. And of course, in order of composition, those are Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. And we've already covered Macbeth, touched on it. So Lear has long been recognized as one of Shakespeare's great masterpieces, and that great tragedies tag shouldn't be taken too seriously. Someone could quite easily make an argument that, for me at least, certainly Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra could be talked about, put on the same shelf as those other plays, great as they are. Someone else might say Julius Caesar or whatnot. But there is no question that these four plays are special. They still, to this day, are some of the entries in Shakespeare's canon which people are most excited to go and see at the theater, which theatrical companies are most excited to stage, which are seen as having some of the best, richest, meatiest roles for actors and actresses. And Lear is maybe the trickiest one of them all. On the one hand, King Lear, of all those tragedies, it's not the most savage, it's not the most harrowing necessarily, but it's the bleakest. It's the most disenchanted of Shakespeare's tragedies. Since the Romantic movement, 200 years ago, give or take, it's often been considered Shakespeare's greatest play. It would vie with Hamlet for that honor. And a great case could be made for either Hamlet or King Lear by someone who was arguing for the greatest of Shakespeare's works. But it's also long been recognized as a kind of difficult and even messy play. Macbeth and Othello in particular have this sort of driving singularity of purpose that means they work really beautifully for the stage, because we're kind of carried along by a single story that we go deep with, whereas King Lear sprawls out. A.C. Bradley, very distinguished critic whom I've mentioned before, said that King Lear, and he was a profound admirer of it, but he said that King Lear is too vast for the stage. And reading the play, I think most people would understand what Bradley's saying, or even seeing it. It can be very well done, and I've seen at least one excellent performance of King Lear in the past. But it's not an easy thing to do because it rambles and sort of spills over. We have two plots that we follow. For one thing, the Lear plot and the Gloucester family plot. And we range around the island of Great Britain in a kind of helter-skelter way. And so it's a difficult play, but difficult things are often very worthwhile. So we've got in King Lear an old story, a story whose roots go back a long way before Shakespeare, a story of an old king in the primordial age, in the early Bronze Age, roughly, 1,500 years or more before Shakespeare's birth, a king who divides his kingdom of Britain between three daughters, or he wants to divide it between three daughters, of course. As we just heard, he actually divides it between two because one daughter refuses to give him the flattery that he wants. When Shakespeare took up the subject around about 1604, 05, 06, he was taking up a subject that other dramatists had already tried their hand at. There is at least one other play called King Lear, although spelled differently, Leir, that had been written in the previous decade, in the 1590s. Shakespeare took the subject up and he made radical changes. First of all, he added the Gloucester family plot, which is such an important piece of his play, but which was invented out of whole cloth. And then he did things to the ending, which at the time would have been viewed as controversial. And now, while they may not be controversial, still have the power to shock us. He turned a melodrama, a story where there is a more or less happy ending at the end, into his gravest and saddest of tragedies. King Lear is a play that grapples with major philosophical questions, questions of good and evil, the meaning of suffering, the nature of love, parent-child relationships, and big existential questions about the place of man in a seemingly hostile cosmos. It's also a play that's quite seriously concerned with deep political questions, questions of authority and legitimacy, questions of true service and what is owed. King Lear asks us to consider whether any human being can really be trusted with power. And it's also a play, and this might sound very banal and cliched, but it is not, even if it is as the way I put it, it's not as Shakespeare handles it. It's a play that's exploring what makes us human and whether we can unmake our own humanity or whether another can do that to us. And perhaps also whether our broken humanity can be remade and redeemed. So we'll plunge in. However, I have to say I'm going to do one thing today that's a little bit different. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while now, you know my method, which is to open the episode with a passage, usually a short-ish passage, and then yammer at you for a while on the work in question, and then dive into what I consider the main passage, which is usually meatier, and then circle back to that intro passage. And I don't know why I cooked up this approach, but I think it's served us pretty well. Today, I'm not going to obey my own formula, though, and it's just for practical reasons. I wanted to talk about the passage you've heard from the throne room scene in Act 1, early in Act 1. And I also want to talk about another passage, which I'll give you in a few minutes, which is from the end of Act 1. Act 1, Scene 4 in most editions of the play. But I decided that I'd first better address the intro passage before we dive into that second passage. I had it up front. I wanted to put it up front as the intro passage because it's simpler and more straightforward and cleaner than the one I'm about to do, the longer one. But also, I think I need to kind of deal with what it's giving us before I move on to that other second passage. So I might just be getting in my own head at this point and making trouble where none needs to exist. But I thought this is the way I'd come at it this time around. So I'll say a few words about that passage you've already heard, which is from the famous opening of the play. The play actually begins with a kind of strange, off-to-the-side conversation between three noblemen at Lear's court, the Earl of Kent, the Earl of Gloucester, and the Earl of Gloucester's son, Edmund. And then we get this fanfare of trumpets, and the king enters. And you heard what happens next. King Lear is going to retire. He has decided he has ruled a long time, and it's been enough. And he's tired, and he says, to shake all cares and business and confer it on younger strengths, while we unburdened crawl towards death. He sees himself being at the end of things, and so he's going to abdicate his throne. He's going to give his kingdom to his heirs, not to his heir, but to his heirs. So he's going to divide his kingdom between his three daughters, giving each of them a piece as dowry for their husbands. His two elder daughters, Goneril and Regan, are married to great British lords, and so that's fairly straightforward. They will each get a piece of the kingdom. His youngest daughter, his most beloved daughter, Cordelia, is not yet married, but there are two foreign princes in the room, the King of France and the King of Burgundy, who are both vying for her hand because Cordelia is famous for being beautiful and virtuous and also for being the daughter of a king. And so these two men are interested in having her as a bride. And of course, they would then be inheritor of the third of the kingdom that she will be given. So that's all straightforward enough. But of course, Lear doesn't simply sign the documents and give the kingdom away. He wants it to be contingent on their performance in this little game he's concocted. Each of them has to explain to him before all the court how much they love him. And in return for this profession of love, they will each be granted a piece of the kingdom. And you saw what happens. So First of all, I think we have to imagine this. Critics will debate this point. I think it's important to imagine this as a very formal and ceremonial affair, that this is about Lear's public ego, that he takes for granted the fact privately that his daughters love him, but that as he's laying down his crown, he needs, for the satisfaction of his ego, to have them all make this great statement of devotion to him before the gathered nobility of his island. And so when Cordelia dissents from this, it's not that it's not the same as if privately in a one-on-one conversation she had refused to tell her father she loves him. That would be a very different matter. It's rather that she refuses to give him this public statement, which she sees as artificial and twisted. And so that might be a distinction that not all of you care to appreciate, but I do think it's an important one, that this is a big day for him and he wants it to be recognized as such by these men who up until now have been dependent on his every whim, but who are shortly going to simply be fellow Britons alongside him. He wants this to be a public recognition that he really is the font of all virtue and the reason these three women and their husbands are now in charge. And so Cordelia will refuse to go along with it. So going a little more deeply into the passage I opened with, Lear is dividing his kingdom. And I think we may take that for granted in a sort of fairy tale way, that that's what the king decides to do. But we have to imagine Shakespeare's audience living in their own kingdom in this island, ruled over by James I, as seeing this as quite a questionable and troubling decision on Lear's part, the idea that the kingdom would be divided, and also the idea that the ruling king, whom they understand as being anointed by God to rule, would abdicate and would give up his crown. That this is a decision that would be a very serious one and a troubling one for them. But Lear has made this decision, and so this is what he's going to do. And of course, no one gainsays him. He doesn't have a son to whom he can leave the kingdom, and so he's going to portion it out between his daughters. Cordelia is the daughter that he loves the most, and we all know that parents who talk about loving one child the most are really not very wise and are really making trouble for themselves down the road. But he loves Cordelia the most, he says. And so she's to get, how does he put it? He's to get the third more opulent than your sisters. So she's to get the nicest part of the kingdom. That's the idea. And then he asks them to begin. So we've got here this old man who has made this decision to retire. He can no longer handle the role anymore. But in asking for these public declarations of love, we see that he still very much craves recognition and esteem. And that will be true in the scenes that follow after he has retired. It will become very clear that Lear does not, like a Byzantine emperor or like the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, he does not intend to go off to a monastery or anything like that and live out his remaining days in quietness, in prayerful quietness. Instead, he wants to shake off the responsibilities of rule while still maintaining prestige. He will take with him his stipulation in giving up the kingdom, he says, is that he gets to take 100 knights with him into his retirement. Now, why does anyone need 100 knights? He's no longer interested in ruling, so it's not like he needs a military force. He wants 100 knights because of prestige, because he wants a retinue. The same reason NBA players don't go to a restaurant or a club by themselves or just with themselves and their date. Instead, they go with a crowd of people because that entourage magnifies their importance, that there are a bunch of people eating and drinking on their tab following them around. And so Lear wants these 100 knights whose salaries, so to speak, will be paid for by his daughters who now run the kingdom, but that he will get this private entourage. And so he will still get to feel like the big man at the center of things, even though he no longer has the care and responsibility of rule. And so that's troubling enough, but of course, even more troubling is that he's going to tee all this up by the love contest that he is going to have his daughters engage in. Which of you shall we say doth love us most, that we our largest bounty may extend? So here from the very beginning, we see Lear taking for granted the idea that love can be quantified, that love is something that can be measured according to the grandiosity of someone's words, just as status can supposedly be measured, not just status, human value can be quantified according to the size of the retinue that one has, the entourage. And so it's Goneril's turn, the eldest daughter, it's Goneril's turn to speak first, and she does not disappoint him. Goneril's speech is fun to read because it is so ridiculous. It's so high-flown that it makes us queasy. We do not believe her at all from the very point at which she begins speaking. And we know that someone who speaks like this is necessarily insincere, given the context. We recognize that immediately. Lear either does not care about the question of sincerity, or he is so inured to his power and his position that the idea of sincerity means nothing to him at all. And so Goneril tells her father that I love you beyond anything. I love you more than anything in life, beyond anything else of value. I love you more than my own eyesight, than my own liberty. I love you more than any child has ever loved a father. And I love you so much that I can barely say how much I love you. Goneril does a nice job. She does such a good job that, of course, she leaves sister number 2, Regan, in a difficult position. Because how do you follow that? Regan knows exactly how you follow it. The way you follow a speech like that when it's your turn, after Lear has explained to Goneril what he's going to dole out to her in return for that speech, Regan, when it's her turn, says, same as me, only more. That's basically exactly what she says to Lear, although, of course, she puts it better. She says, I'm just like my sister. I value you just the way she says it, only she didn't go far enough. And she says, it's not just that I love you more than anything, but I consider myself an enemy to anything else in the world that might vie for your love. I am alone felicitate in your dear highness's love. So that's the only thing that makes me happy. And so Lear is quite pleased with this. There's someone who's not very happy right now, however, and that's the youngest sister, Cordelia. Lear, at least we have to say, has the good taste to choose the right daughter as his favorite, even though that choice gets sharply cut off in this scene when she disappoints him. But Lear has been expecting, first of all, that Cordelia will do the best job of the 3 sisters, as she clearly has done up till now in loving him, because she sincerely loves him. She's done the best job of the 3 sisters and will get the biggest piece of the pie, the nicest part of the island, which Shakespeare clearly in the play, for what it's worth, equates with England. Goneril gets the north, so Scotland, and Regan gets the west country of Wales and Cornwall. Cordelia is to get that part of the island of Britain, which has always been the most populous and the most agriculturally fertile, England, and also, of course, the part where Shakespeare and his audience comes from. So there's some sort of English chauvinism here. She is to get this piece because, of course, she'll do the best job. And then Lear later says that his plan all along has been when he goes into retirement that he's going to live with Cordelia. He's going to surrender himself up to what he calls her kind nursery because he knows she's the one who'll take the best care of him. Cordelia, we can imagine being happy enough to take that responsibility on, but she is not going to take this responsibility on, this responsibility of flattering the old man. Lear is at this point akin to an alcoholic or an addict, and to flatter him, as far as Cordelia is concerned, is the equivalent of giving an alcoholic a bottle of bourbon, and she is not going to do that. Some readers, some viewers, and some critics think that Cordelia is culpable in this. And there are critics who have actually, over the last few generations, argued that the whole root of the problem in King Lear is Cordelia's failure just to hold her nose and get it over with. If you know the play, you'll know that had she done that, we can imagine that horrible things would have been avoided if she'd just bitten the bullet and given her father what he wanted. He's half senile, it seems anyway, or at least at this point, maybe a quarter senile. The very fact that he wants this shows that he's not altogether right. And so, of course, it would be galling for a true-hearted child to spout this flattery to a parent. But would it not be better than what follows? Well, we can't blame Cordelia for not knowing the disaster that will follow from all of this. But I think those who question her choice in this point are wrong. I am not saying that if I were Cordelia, I would have the bravery to make her choice, because it becomes immediately apparent, and she must have known this in advance, knowing who her father is. It becomes immediately apparent that the consequences of Lear not getting what he wants are enormous. She will be banished, and she will be banished with curses, and she will be told that if she sets foot on the island again, she is dead. And at that point, she doesn't have a husband. She will have a husband very shortly, because one of these two suitors, the King of France, turns out to be an extremely decent man and a man of great integrity. So he's happy enough to marry her, but had he not, she would have been an impoverished beggar, having to stow away in the hold of a ship to get out of her father's kingdom where she's been banished. So the consequences of what Cordelia does are enormous. And as I say, it's not as though it would be a small thing to accept them, but she does accept them. She is offering asides to us as her sisters are speaking their speeches of flattery to Lear that show that she knows what she's faced with and that she cannot do it and that there will be consequences. She calls herself privately to us in an aside, poor Cordelia, knowing that the consequences are going to be grim. What should Cordelia do? She asks. Those are her first lines. This, for me, for what it's worth, is the most luminous and most admirable character in all of Shakespeare, Cordelia, in this play. Shakespeare generally gives us pretty compromised heroes, and I, for one, don't love his heroes any the less because they're compromised, because they're imperfect. But with Cordelia, I think he's given us a rare example of a wholly admirable person. If not a perfect person, a wholly admirable person. And the first thing she says as she comes before us is, what should Cordelia do? Well, I think I'm probably the weak sort of person that would not make the choice she makes. But she makes the choice to be true. She says she will love and be silent. As far as Lear's concerned, loving goes along with speaking, because loving is something that he assumes, as I said earlier, loving is something that can be quantified, and one of the ways you quantify it is with words. Cordelia makes the choice to love rather than to talk about loving. She will love and be silent. She will not participate. We have to understand this is not like it's around the Lear kitchen table after dinner, where someone might try to gently argue with their cantankerous old father and say, now, Father, you have to remember that just because one talks about love doesn't mean it's genuine. This is in the throne room. This is a state occasion. She doesn't have the scope and maybe doesn't have the confidence to contradict Lear. And so she will simply not participate. And that comes out so powerfully when he finally turns to her and says, okay, it's your turn. And now he's really excited because Cordelia is the best of all his daughters, and she's going to really come through for him and knock his socks off. What are you going to say to gain a third more opulent than your sisters speak? And she says, nothing, my lord. Nothing, my lord. Nothing is a word that is extremely important to King Lear. It comes up over and over again in this play. And it's a word. It's a commonplace word. We might not think too much about that, but when we slow down and see how prominent this word is in the play, how many important exchanges include the word nothing, we realize that Shakespeare is thinking about nothing in this play and what nothing is. What is nothing? Technically, according to a dictionary definition, nothing is sheer negation. It's absence. It's not a positive thing. And of course, we understand that. But there are ways in human life where nothing can be a kind of something. To not do rather than to do can have a kind of quality to it. And so Cordelia's silence, her nothing, is more of a something than the daughter's somethings are, than her sister's somethings are. Her nothing conveys love, even though Lear cannot recognize it. What should Cordelia do? Love and be silent. And so her nothing has something in it which is truer and realer than the distorted, corrupt flattery of her sisters. So she says, nothing, my lord. Lear says, in surprise, nothing? And she repeats the word. It's this amazing exchange where the word nothing comes 5 times in 4 lines. Cordelia says, nothing, my lord. Lear says, nothing? Cordelia says, nothing. And then Lear says, nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. And of course, nothing comes from nothing. We understand that. We all know what the answer is if you multiply any number by 0. We know what you get. We know that mathematically speaking, nothing can come of nothing. We know that if you divide 0 by 6 or by 60,000, you get 0. But of course, nothing isn't only 0 in the mathematical sense. Within human culture and human interactions, nothings, as I said, can be somethings. And so Lear gets nothing from Cordelia, but what he gets from Cordelia is truer and richer and even more beautiful than he has the wits to recognize. Cordelia then goes on and says, she tells us something about herself, and it's borne out in the play through other scenes that we find her in. She says, she makes an admission. She says, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. This is one of a couple of different points in the play where she sort of confesses, I'm not very good with words. Maybe if she had the silver-tongued abilities of a Hamlet or even of a Goneril, she would be able to actually argue with her father and explain what she's doing or how she understands things. But she doesn't. She simply says, I don't have anything to say, and I can't put my heart into my mouth. And she says something that seems very callous, if we're not looking at the context. She says, I love my majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. And that seems like such a cold thing to say. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. Is that statement not the very sort of quantification of love that I suggested Lear is erroneously foisting on himself and on us? The idea that love is a matter of hard facts and of quid pro quos. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. Who wants to think about someone on a deathbed being told by their child that, well, I love you because you are my uncle or my grandmother or my sister or whatever it is, and so I love you to the point that one should love an uncle or a grandmother or a sister. We don't want to think about love in those terms. That seems cold-blooded. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, as Cordelia goes on to say, human beings love in a bunch of different directions, and that is healthy. And the love of child for parent, as with parent for child, is supposed to be rich and true and strong and important, but it is not supposed to be everything. Not if you want to be happy and healthy. It is one relationship that involves one or maybe a couple of kinds of love. And of course, for, say, the parent and the child, it is taken to the infinite degree. In other words, if the child needs the parent's sacrifice, the parent makes the sacrifice. But that does not mean the parent is supposed to love the child to the exclusion of all other relationships, or that the child is supposed to love the parent that way. And Cordelia immediately brings up the question of marriage, because her two sisters are married. And she says to her father, and of course to everyone else who's overhearing, what's this all about? They're married, and they're saying to you that they worship you to the exclusion of all else. Regan says that she's an enemy to all other loves. Cordelia is pressing on the fact that everyone involved knows that this is a kind of formal insincerity that they're engaged in. But she also, knowing that Lear has lost the ability to distinguish between real expression of feeling and ceremonial expression, she's pressing on the fact that this is sick and twisted, if it is true. That her sisters, if they really love their father in this way, are, emotionally crippled, are sick, and that he is sick to ask them for this. There are many kinds of love that we are called on to exercise, and those don't and shouldn't need to generally compete with one another. But we all know what happens when a parent gets jealous of a child's spouse, or when a parent gets jealous because the child shows affection for the other parent or something like that. That's a family in a very unhappy condition. The healthy parent would recognize that the child needs to love others beyond themselves. And so Cordelia is foregrounding all of this common sense and telling Lear that what he calls nothing is in fact something. And so her realism has more warmth and beauty in it by far than the gold-plated nothings, the true nothings of Regan and Goneril, because they speak somethings but feel nothings. And for Cordelia, it is the opposite. Lear, however, reminds her of the quantification. He says, mend your speech lest it mar your fortunes. Remember, if you want something, you have to give something. And Cordelia reveals at this point that her love for Lear is not transactional. Her love for Lear is not, unlike his and unlike the love of her sisters for their father, her love for Lear is not dependent on what he does for her. And that she would rather speak the truth and in doing so really love him than she would gain from him by speaking a lie. Love in this play is sacrificial. Love in this play, in particular with the character of Cordelia, but whenever it comes up, love in this play always costs. Our loves always have the possibility to cost us something. That's what they mean. But in this play, part of what makes it so painful and beautiful, beautifully painful, is that the price of love in this play is terrifyingly high at every point. And that begins here. And so Cordelia goes on and says to her father, I'm not going to play this game. I am not going to pretend the way my sisters did, that this is what love is. And Lear calls her untender. He says, so young and so untender. And she says, so young, my lord, and true. And he says, then let thy truth be thy dower. In other words, you've failed, and you will void the transaction, because this was all a transaction for him. The sisters recognize it to be a transaction. Lear doesn't exactly, I think, recognize it to be a transaction. He doesn't understand the difference between flattery and sincerity, between the expression of a thing publicly and the actual meaning. And so he says, this is all you get. Thy truth then be thy dower. You can have your truth. And as terrible as it is to be thrust out like Cordelia or like other characters in this play, like Edgar, like Kent, eventually like Lear himself, like the Earl of Gloucester, there are a bunch of characters in this play who wind up with what looks like nothing. But it is better to have that truth and to have nothing else. It is better to have the conviction. It is better to have the integrity. It is better to have the love than to have all of the things that the privileged have. And so she will get nothing from him because as far as he's concerned, she has given him nothing. And then he curses her. And it's a terrible speech of cursing, that he absolutely relinquishes her, that he damns her, that he says, as he says, I disclaim all paternal care, any recognition that we share the same blood, and cannibals are as much kin to me as you are. And so this is what initiates the action of King Lear. From this scene, from this simple failure of a young girl to flatter her old father in his dotage will come horrible things. Some of the most painful and cruel events in all of Shakespeare. At this point, Cordelia is banished. One man quite bravely speaks up for her. This is the Earl of Kent, Lear's old friend, and the Earl of Kent takes the same position that Cordelia does, in that he intervenes and says to Lear, stop this, you're doing wrong. And Lear says, shut up, Kent. He says, stand not between the dragon and his wrath. In other words, don't get in front of her, you're going to get burned. And Kent refuses to. And he says, Lear, listen to her. She's the one you can trust. And so Lear banishes Kent, seeing him as a hater, as the kids would say, rather than recognizing that, like Cordelia, Kent is one of the few who really loves him. And Kent is making the same sacrificial gesture that Cordelia makes. Kent and Cordelia are both banished. Cordelia will become the bride of the King of France, so temporarily at least she lands on her feet. But Kent, instead of heading for the nearest ship, tells us that he's going to go in disguise. He's going to disguise himself as a working class man because he's worried about what's going to happen to Lear. And he still loves Lear, even though he has every reason not to. And he wants to hang around the edges of wherever Lear is in case he can help or protect his old master. Lear now divides the kingdom in two instead of three. And so the older two daughters and their husbands are going to be the rulers of Britain. And Lear says, all right, new plan. I can't go into retirement with Cordelia. That means I've got to go into retirement with you two. So I'll divide my time between your two courts. You'll be happy with that, of course, because we all just heard how much you love me. And you'll just take care of me. And also remember, I've got these 100 knights, which you're going to be paying for and also feeding and putting up. And I'm really looking forward to doing a lot of hunting and having a lot of parties with my knights. And so this is where we pick up again in Act 1, Scene 4, which is the next passage I'll look at. Lear, as far as he's concerned, has fallen into clover. He's living in the north at Goneril and Albany's home, And it's a few weeks later, maybe a few months, something like that, and things have been terrific as far as he's concerned. We find him coming in after a day's hunting with his knights. He says as he comes in, it's kind of great, just selfish old man. He says, "I'll not stay a jot for dinner. I'll not stay a jot for dinner." In other words, he's coming in, taking his muddy boots off and saying, "I want food now." And this is a headache. It's really hard to blame Goneril and Regan for not being thrilled with this. But what they're going to do to mitigate this problem is a lot worse than simply getting the old man, finagling him into a nursing home. But Lear is running his own sort of private kingdom from Goneril's castle. His knights are rowdy and boisterous and they're causing trouble, and yet Goneril's not allowed to discipline them because they're Lear's knights rather than hers. And he has been rude and selfish, and he's given them another problem. There's someone else who's with Lear right now, and we're about to meet him, and that is the Fool. The Fool, of course, is a jester. He's a professional clown who occupies a very particular place in this world, in the world of European politics. The jester is an entertainer, of course. The jester offers pratfalls and singing and silliness and mockery. But the Fool, the jester, also has a special prerogative of being able to mock the king himself. Lear's jester, his Fool, drives Goneril crazy, and she wants him gone. Lear, however, keeps the Fool with him, even though, as we shall see, the Fool has some hard things to say to Lear, because he has this prerogative of being able to mock even his lord and master, the king. And this Fool uses that prerogative. And so we come upon, we're picking up with Lear and the Fool in the middle of Act 1, Scene 4 at this point. We're picking up with Lear and the Fool in the middle of Act 1, Scene 4 at this point, and with one other character as well, the Earl of Kent, who, as I told you, is in disguise as a working man. Kent has just offered to serve Lear, and Lear appreciates this man at this point. He doesn't recognize his old friend Kent, who I guess has grown out his beard and is wearing shabby clothes for reasons we won't get into, but Lear is going to take him on. And so when this episode begins, Lear has just agreed to hire Kent, and so he gives him money. And so the Fool comes in, and he's going to offer Kent his coxcomb. And this is an important word in this little exchange. The coxcomb is the Fool's cap. So the famous jester's cap made of multicolor motley cloth with often bells on it, the famous jester's cap. So this is where we'll pick up now, King Lear, Act 1, Scene 4. So imagine these three men, Lear, Kent in his working clothes, the Fool looking ridiculous in his motley, and the Fool will hand Kent his coxcomb. So you've already heard King Lear. I'm going to try not to state the character names before the speeches, because when I do that, I think it sounds really artificial. I'm going to try to do my usual trick of changing up my voice and accent enough. So you've heard what Lear sounds like. He sounds like this, a little bit Churchillian, although angrier than Churchill. The Fool's going to sound like this in a sort of higher voice and a sort of rustic country accent. And then Kent had better be, he's adopting the voice of a working class man, but we'll make his voice sort of not as high as the Fool's and not as gruff as Lear's. So we'll make Kent's voice sound like that, something like that. So I'll do my best so you don't get too confused. So here we go. Let me hire him too. Here's my coxcomb. How now, my pretty knave, how dost thou? Sirrah, you were best take my coxcomb. Why, Fool?
Why, for taking one's part that's out of favour. Nay, and thou canst not smile as the wind sits, thou'll catch cold shortly. There, take my coxcomb. Why, this fella's banished two on's daughters, and did the third a blessing against his will. If thou follow him, thou must needs wear my coxcomb. How now, nuncle? Would I had 2 coxcombs and 2 daughters?
Why, my boy?
If I gave them all my living, I'd keep my coxcombs myself. There's mine. Beg another of thy daughters.
Take heed, sirrah, the whip.
Truce a dog must to kennel. He must be whipped out when Lady the Bratch may stand by the fire and stink.
A pestilent gall to me.
Sirrah, I'll teach thee a speech.
Do.
Mark it, nuncle. Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest, lend less than thou owest, ride more than thou goest, learn more than thou trowest, set less than thou throwest, leave thy drink and thy whore, and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2 tens to a score. This is nothing, fool. Then 'tis like the breath of an unfeed lawyer, you gave me nothing for it. Can you make no use of nothing, nuncle?
Why, no, boy. Nothing can be made out of nothing.
Prithee tell him so much the rent of his land comes to, he'll not believe a fool.
A bitter fool.
Dost thou know the difference, my boy, between a bitter fool and a sweet fool?
No, lad, teach me.
That lord that counsel thee to give away thy land, come place him here by me, do thou for him to stand. The sweet and bitter fool will presently appear, the one in motley here, the other found out there.
Dost thou call me fool, boy?
All thy other titles thou hast given away, that thou wast born with. This is not altogether fool, my lord. No, faith, lords and great men will not let me. If I had monopoly out, they would have part on it, and ladies too. They will not let me have all fool to myself, they'll be snatching. Give me an egg, nuncle, and I'll give thee 2 crowns.
What 2 crowns shall they be?
Why, after I have cut the egg in the middle and ate up the meat, the 2 crowns of the egg. When thou clovest thy crown in the middle and gavest away both parts, thou borest thy ass on thy back over the dirt. Thou hadst little wit in thy bold crown when thou gavest thy golden one away. If I speak like myself in this, let him be whipped that first finds it so. Fools had never less wit in a year, for wise men are grown foppish. They know not how their wits appear, their manners are so apish.
When will you want to be full of songs, sirrah?
I've used it, nuncle, ever since thou madest thy daughters thy mothers. For when thou gavest them the rod and putst down thine own breeches, I marvel what kin thou and thy daughters are. They'll have me whipped for speaking true, they'll have me whipped for lying, and sometimes I'm whipped for holding my peace. I'd rather be any kind of thing than a fool. And yet I would not be thee, nuncle. Thou'st pared thy wit on both sides and left nothing in the middle. I'm better than thou art now. I'm a fool. Thou art nothing. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for putting up with that. I hope you were able to follow it pretty well. It might not have made complete sense to many of you, and that's okay. Shakespeare's comic scenes are more difficult for the average reader or theater goer these days than a scene of high tragedy or sweet romance is, because the jokes, often of the lower class characters in particular, just are so linguistically obscure to the modern ear that we sometimes struggle. But hopefully I read that in a way that made it more or less accessible. And I should also mention, I should have said this earlier, I did a little redacting, a little cutting in that passage and took out some things that I thought would get in the way. But here is a strange conversation between Lear and his professional idiot and Kent, who's very much on the fringes. We notice 2 things about Lear in this conversation. One is how irascible he is. He gets frustrated with the fool very quickly and threatens several times to whip him. The language of whipping runs all through that conversation. Beating, which says something about the atmosphere here. But we also know that Lear puts up with it.
and indeed keeps the conversation with the fool going. So he expresses frustration with the fool, but I think he's kind of just a nasty old man who's used to roaring and raving and people not always taking it super seriously. And also, there's a certain game going on here that both Lear and the fool recognize, where the fool needles Lear, and Lear puts up with it, and he expresses anger, but he lets it keep going and is always interested in what the fool's going to say next. And I would say off the top, King Lear is a play, as I've said, about the loss of humanity, the potential loss of humanity, of personhood, of the constitution of human value. And so Lear has a lot to lose. The next few acts are going to get worse and worse and worse for him, and he will lose more and more and more. He said in the throne room scene I read at the opening, he used the word divest when he talked about giving away his kingdom. And this is a play about divestment, about being stripped of everything. And that's what's going to happen to him. And he is in that going to haltingly, stumblingly, imperfectly find his humanity again. He'll never grip it securely. He'll never be completely morally sound. But we will see him recognize some of the things that he had failed to recognize in his time of pomp and splendor. One of the ways in which we can appreciate this has to do with the fool. At the very least, Lear still has his fool. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because as angry and as self-satisfied and as self-regarding as this horrible old man is, he can still stand to be mocked by the fool. His daughters have no patience for the fool. A couple of other villainous characters have no patience for the fool. But Lear still allows himself to be mocked by the fool. And in the very dark moment that's coming up for him in the Tempest scenes in Act 3, the fool will stick by him. When he is out on the heath in the rain and wind and thunder and lightning and the cold, when he is the greatest fool in all of Britain, facing the elements outside of the warm castle walls, the fool is, of course, the only one foolish enough to stand by him, or I shouldn't say the only one, but the one who sticks closest to him, because only a fool would follow this man. Only a fool would love this man. And so Lear still holds on to the fool, and that tells us something about him, because the fool does not mince his words. And Lear says at one point that he's a bitter fool. In other words, it's not some gentle ribbing that the fool is giving Lear, it's something much more savage. What is nothing? It's a topic we've talked about. Another way to maybe spin the same question, or maybe a variation of it, would be to say, what is folly? What does it mean to be a fool? Is a fool someone who can't do basic arithmetic? Is a fool someone who can't understand complex arguments? Is a fool someone who suffers on behalf of another? Is a fool someone who tells the truth when it's strategically inopportune? Cordelia, of course, is a great fool from that perspective. There is a link in this play, as there are in other parts of Shakespeare's corpus, between a kind of folly and love. It is better, from the perspective of this play, to be what the world might regard as a fool than to be a Goneril or an Edmund or a Regan or a Cornwall. It is better to be a fool than to be the sort of daughter who would flatter the father. It's better to be a fool than to think you can size up how much each of your children love you and give them the rewards you think they deserve for that. It's better to be a fool. There's nothing more foolish from this perspective than love. Love is the greatest stupidity of which human beings are capable. Think about that for a minute. Why would you love someone? Why would you go and do something that stupid? Of course you might enjoy people. Of course you might find them convenient. You might have a good time with them. They might be entertaining. They might be useful instruments to you. But why would you love them? Because if you're loving them, you're surrendering a certain amount of your own autonomy and decision-making. If you love a person, you are sacrificing your heart. Potentially, at least, sometimes unquestionably, you're sacrificing your heart. They might disappoint you. They might fail you. Even if they don't mean to, they might die. You might lose them. And then you'll reap the rewards of your folly, which is suffering. To love someone from a certain perspective is to be very foolish. I think I talked about this a little bit in our Midsummer Night's Dream episode, although there it was from the perspective of comedy, and the flavor was quite different. Here we're in the sour realm of tragedy, the bitter realm of tragedy. Bitter, of course, the word attached to the fool. To love someone is to be very foolish from a hard-headed, practical perspective. It's to give up control. And so, what does it mean to be a fool? Well, the fool puts his finger on this at the very outset. Kent has just, in his disguise, said that he will serve Lear. And so the fool immediately offers Kent his fool's cap and says, "You need this." And Kent says, "Why?" And the fool says, "For taking the part of one that's out of favor. You know, of all the people you could serve, why would you serve this guy? How big a fool are you to serve this guy? Don't you know that he gave everything away? If you're going to serve someone, should be the person who can really reward you. You're a fool. You're like me. And so you'd better have my coxcomb." And he then goes on and he talks about the coxcomb, this badge of the fool. And he suggests that Lear is the one who should have the coxcomb. He says, if I gave both my daughters everything I had, my living, I'd keep my coxcombs. He says at that point he'd need 2 coxcombs. Then he offers Lear his coxcomb just as he had offered it to Kent and says, "There's mine, beg another of my daughters." In other words, 1 fool's cap for each daughter. Lear threatens him with the whip. The fool laughs this off. The fool talks about how truth always gets whipped. The truth is like a dog that gets whipped to the kennel. While Lady the Bratch, he says, in other words, this fine dog, this flattering dog, gets to stand by the fire and stink. But truth always gets whipped. And of course, the fool is the one who speaks truth. And he can speak truth because he's a fool. He has the prerogative to speak the truth, to pop the balloons, to get away with things, because of course everyone knows he's a fool. Lear says that the fool is a pestilent gall. He's associating the fool, that line reminds me, that line and the bitter fool line remind me of the way Socrates describes himself in Plato's Apology, in the Apology of Socrates. This is the defense speech Socrates makes on his own behalf before the court of Athens when he's being tried for various crimes against the state, because the Athenian state in 399 scapegoats Socrates for recent political and military disasters by saying that Socrates has been stirring up trouble in the city. And as Plato records it, Socrates defends himself in various ways against this charge. But one of the things he says of himself is that the people of Athens don't realize how lucky they are to have him. Why? Well, he says he is like a stinging fly, the gadfly. He's the stinging fly. He says the city of Athens is like a great horse that would get complacent and run down and soft, but for the fact that he, the gadfly, keeps stinging the horse so that it has to flash its tail and prance around the paddock trying to get away. Socrates, with the questions he asks and the popping of balloons that he does, he says, the best thing that anyone could do for Athens, reminding Athens of the truth and demanding that the Athenians ask questions of themselves. The Socratic principle, of course, that some of you will know, is that there are only wise men who recognize that they are fools, and fools who believe that they are wise. And so the fool is the gall, the pestilent gall, the bitter fool to Lear. But the fool has said, I'm speaking the truth, and I'm telling you what you don't want to recognize. He then goes on and says to Lear, I'll teach you a speech. And Lear, he's up for this. He's always interested in what the fool's got to say. And so he says, do. And the fool gives him this strange little rhyme, strange little bit of doggerel. Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest, lend less than thou owest, ride more than thou goest, so ride more than you walk, learn more than thou trowest, learn more than you trust, set less than thou throwest, so bet less than you have when you're dicing. Leave thy drink and thy whore and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2 tens to a score. Now, there's a lot in this strange little speech, and we could really do a painstaking job of cracking it open. But I'll sum it up just in the interests of time. The fool is saying in various ways through this little rhyme the principle of recognize that what is internal should be more valuable than what is external. Recognize that one should display less than one has. Recognize that the deep should count more than the superficial. And behave yourself, I guess, as it ends. Leave thy drink and thy whore. Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest. Who does that sound like? Well, it sounds like Cordelia. Cordelia had more than she showed, specifically love. And she spoke less than she knew, specifically of love. And so the fool gives this jangling, funny little rhyme to Lear, and Kent, who's a pretty impressive person in lots of ways, but isn't quite up to speed, says, this is nothing, fool. This is just gibberish. Kent very shortly will start to recognize that the fool is saying things that deserve to be taken seriously. But right now he's trying to grasp what's going on here. And so he says, this is nothing, fool. And so the fool said, well, you didn't pay me anything for it. You paid me nothing for it. We're already starting to see this nothing add up again in this scene. And so he says, can you make no use of nothing, nuncle? Nuncle being his sort of diminutive nickname for Lear. Can you make no use of nothing, nuncle? Kent has just heard my little rhyme about having less than you show. And he said that it's nothing. But can't you do anything with nothing? And Lear says, why no, boy, nothing can be made out of nothing. And of course, that line has to take us back to where we began the episode. Lear saying, nothing can be made out of nothing, takes us back to when he told Cordelia, nothing will come of nothing. The fool has spoken nothing, but there's more truth, of course, in the fool's nothing than there is in the wisdom of many who are held to be wise. Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest. And so Lear thinks this is a nothing that he can do nothing with. You can't take this piece of advice and use it to play the stock market or to plan out a military campaign. He doesn't recognize the value in what the fool said. He may come to.
The fool plays more with this idea of nothing because Lear missed the point, and he says, well, so much the rent of his land comes to. He will not believe a fool. Prithee tell him so much the rent of his land comes to. In other words, what money does the rent of Lear's land bring in? Well, nothing, because Lear gave away all his land. And so Lear then goes on and calls him a bitter fool, as we've said. The fool says, what's the difference between a bitter fool and a sweet one? And he explains that I may be the bitter fool. The sweet fool is the one who counseled you to give away your land. You can call me a bitter fool, but I wasn't telling you to do that. You know, it's one thing if you're going to give away your land because you want a quiet retirement or you want a life of contemplation or of prayer. But we all know, Lear, that that's not you. You still want to be the big shot, but you don't understand that you gave away the basis of your big shottedness. And so go talk to the sweet fool who told you this would be a good idea. And Lear says, you know, again, with this sort of threatening or mock-threatening countenance, he says, dost thou call me fool, boy? And the fool says, all thy other titles thou hast given away, that thou wast born with, which is wonderful. Everything else has been divested. Lear, you've given all the rest of it away. All the rights according to law, all the titles, all the reasons those people bowed for you when you wanted to believe that they bowed for you because of the, you know, inherent majesty of your being. They were bowing because of law, because of title, because of wealth, because of the possibility you had to reward or punish. But you still have the one thing that no one can take from you, Lear. You're still a fool. You might not be a king any longer, but you're still a fool. And Kent shows how quick he is and how wise he is by recognizing he had said just a few minutes ago, he'd said, this is nothing, fool. But now he's starting to recognize that there's something here that he appreciates. And he says to Lear, this is not altogether fool, my lord. In other words, this fool is saying things that aren't foolish. The fool then goes on and he talks about how he's not the only fool, unfortunately, that other people have a share of folly, even though that's supposed to be his gig. He's supposed to be the fool, but all the ones, the lords and great men and the ladies, they all seem to be stealing folly and they won't let him have all to himself. And then he does this wonderful little sort of thought experiment with the egg. And he talks about how, Lear, if you give me an egg, I'll give you 2 crowns. Crown, of course, is a piece of money in Elizabethan England. I think it's worth 5 shillings, so £0.25 sterling. I could be wrong on that. Write in and yell at me virtually if I'm wrong about my coinage. But he's saying, I'll give you 2 crowns for an egg. And he's playing on the idea of the literal crown on the king's head and the crown, the piece of money. And Lear says, what 2 crowns will they be? And the fool says, well, once I've cut the egg in half and taken the meat out, the substance out, I'll give you the 2 crowns of the egg. So you'll have these 2 hollow eggshells to be your crowns. He's imagining, he was playing with the idea of the fool's cap, the coxcomb earlier. Now he's imagining Lear in a kind of dunce's cap, that the crown he now has, one for each daughter, each supposedly loyal and loving daughter, is this empty eggshell on his ass. Because you deserve this, king. What did you do? He said, you took your crown and you cut it in half, your golden crown. You cut it in half between your daughters. So now you get to wear the empty eggshells, and that can be your crown. He said, when you did that, thou borest thy ass on thy back o'er the dirt. Proverbially, what's the sort of thing a fool would do? Well, a fool, instead of riding on his ass, his donkey, would carry his ass over the dirt. And that's what you did, he says, when you gave your kingship away. You had little wit in your bald crown. I guess we imagine Lear as balding when you gave your golden one away, he says. We go on. Lear asks him, he sings a little song, and Lear asks him why he's singing so much nowadays. And the fool says, well, ever since thou madest thy daughters thy mothers, when you gave them the rod and puts down your own breeches. So just like the child would have to pull his pants down and give his mother the cane to smack him with, to punish him, you did that. You did something unnatural. The natural thing is for the parent to look after the child, but you made your daughters your mothers. You did something unnatural, and you're going to pay for it. It's not going to be easy for me, he goes on to say. I know how much your daughters hate me. You're always threatening to whip me. They're always threatening to whip me because they say I'm lying. And so the fool says, my situation is not very choice, but he said, I would rather not be you. It's a wonderful line. I'd rather be any kind of thing than a fool, and yet I would not be thee, nuncle. I wouldn't be you. I'd rather be a fool than be you. The greater fool is you, old man, who thought you could calculate the sweetest deal for yourself and the highest returns, but ended up giving away everything that you valued. I'm better than thou art now. I'm a fool. Thou art, that big word again, nothing. I am a fool. Thou art nothing. All of this causes the beginning of a crisis of identity in Lear. It's going to get so much worse over the next dozen pages. The fool is probing at what is already a sore spot in Lear, an awareness of what he's done. And shortly his daughters, his two older daughters, are going to confirm what folly he has committed. Goneril is sick of the old man, and she writes a letter to Regan, and they work out a plan. They've already talked about this at the end of the throne room scene in Act 1, Scene 1. They're going to start reining him in. They're going to start telling him that they're sick of his nonsense and that if he wants to stay with them, he needs to behave himself and he needs to let go of that great retinue of knights. Remember that way in which he quantified his value and his status, that even though he's not king anymore, he still gets to have 100 knights. Well, ultimately he gave the power away, and so if he wants to keep those knights, the only way he can do it is if Goneril and Regan prove trustworthy, and they do not. And so they will, between them, in a way that's kind of funny but very painful at the same time, they will whittle down the allowance of knights until he has none left. And at that point, he will go mad with anger and also with guilt, because he will begin to recognize that the daughter he banished was the daughter who didn't deserve it. And so it's at that point that he will go out into the storm, where we will find him in our next episode. In his fury and his self-lacerating rage, he will go out into the storm. But already the fool is opening up doubts in him. And so Goneril at this moment comes in and pokes at him and tells him he's got to shape up, and she's getting sick of him, as if she's confirming the fool's recent words about what a ridiculous situation he's put himself in. And Lear begins to worry, even as the fool is continuing to caper and mock him. And so Lear's anger and frustration are starting to bubble. And so he's going to be so angry at Goneril that he's going to say, thank goodness I still have one daughter who loves me. I'm going to go to Regan's house and take my knights. And he'll only discover there that Regan is playing the same game as Goneril. But he's frustrated and upset at this point, angry at what his daughter is telling him. And he says, wonderful potent speech, doth any here know me? This is not Lear. Doth Lear walk thus, speak thus? Where are his eyes? Either his notion weakens, his discernings are lethargies. Waking? 'Tis not so. Who is't can tell me who I am? Who is it that can tell me who I am? Is it me? He says waking, meaning, am I dreaming? He's pinching himself. Is this me?
Is this me? Am I being talked to like this? Is my daughter, who recently stood up and told the whole court how she worshipped me, is she really treating me this way? Am I still Lear? Because Lear, as he had understood himself, was the man of power and status and privilege who was obeyed implicitly and immediately. And now something has changed. Who can tell me who I am? What is left of this person when everything that he had valued and that others, except for a few, whom he did not appreciate, had valued in him, when all of that is taken away? Who is he? Who do we have left? Who can tell me who I am? And the answer comes back from the fool, Lear's shadow. Lear's shadow. Who can tell me who I am? Lear's shadow. That's all you are, old man. You're the outline of the thing we used to call Lear. You still roughly look like him, but all the inside has gone out. All the meat has gone from the egg. There's nothing, because of course, the fool had said to Lear, I'm better than thou art now. I'm a fool, thou art nothing. And now he confirms when Lear asks, who can tell me who I am? Lear's shadow, right? The shadow is the nothing. It's simply the absence of light cast on the sidewalk as you walk along with the sun at your back. It's not a thing unto itself. It's just the absence of light. You have the rough shape of King Lear, but there's nothing there. It's only by going into that truth, insofar as he can go into it, by recognizing the thing that he had never cared about before, which is whether there is something we can call humanity left in a person who seems to have nothing, that Lear will get anywhere. We will save that, however, for our next episode, when we will find him outside in the storm on the heath. In the meantime, this has been Professing Literature. David Anderson signing off on behalf of Eric Williams. Thank you for listening.